Imagine staring at just a completely blank piece of paper.
Right.
You take a pen and you draw two simple intersecting lines. You know, it looks like an airplane, or maybe like a bird in flight.
Yeah, a very rough sketch.
Exactly. Now imagine that just 4 years later, 1,000,000 tons of steel and concrete have somehow transformed that crude sketch into a massive, functioning, futuristic capital city.
Built right in the middle of a barren, dusty savanna.
Thousands of miles from the ocean, no ancient cobblestones, no centuries of organic expansion, just an entire civilization willed into existence. Welcome to our deep dive into Brasilia.
It is such a wild story.
It really is. Today, we are taking you, our listener, on a deep dive into the absolute limits of utopian urban planning, based on this incredibly rich historical and architectural dossier we've got.
We're looking at what happens when a nation tries to literally build its own future from scratch.
And the intense friction that ignites when a perfectly rational blueprint collides with, well, messy, unpredictable human reality.
It is a phenomenal case study. I mean, we're analyzing a city that was explicitly designed to be this machine for progress.
Like encasing a mid-20th century dream in glass and concrete.
Exactly, and sweeping highways. Yet it ultimately evolved into a profound physical manifestation of the exact societal inequalities it was trying to engineer out of existence.
Right, so it's a story of architectural genius, but also immense human sacrifice and, honestly, the hubris of the blank slate. Okay, let's unpack this. We first need to understand the profound geographic anxiety that drove Brazil to even attempt this.
Because abandoning a thriving coastal capital like Rio de Janeiro is a huge deal.
It's a staggering geopolitical gamble. Moving to a patch of red dirt in the deep interior. Why do that?
Well, it was a gamble centuries in the making. To understand that anxiety, you have to look at the structural history of Brazilian power. Since the 1500s, the economic and political lifeblood of the country was inextricably tied to the coast.
Which makes sense, right? Salvador, then Rio.
Right. The orientation was always looking outward across the Atlantic, first toward Portugal, the colonial metropole, and later toward global maritime trade.
But Brazil is huge. It's roughly the size of the contiguous United States.
Exactly. But its interior was largely treated by the coastal elites as this unknown, impenetrable void.
And reading through the timelines, this wasn't just abstract anxiety. It was actually a matter of national security. As far back as the 17th century, Portuguese officials were already floating the idea of pulling the capital inland.
Because they were terrified of naval invasions.
Right, from rival European powers. Moving the capital was a way to shield the heart of the state.
And beyond military defense, I mean, it was about territorial sovereignty. The logic is simple. If a state doesn't occupy its own land, it risks losing it.
That makes total sense. And that logic persisted straight through Brazil's independence.
Yeah, in 1823, José Bonifácio, who was a key architect of their independence, formalized the proposal to build a central capital to integrate the territory.
And he even preemptively named it Brasilia, didn't he?
He did. He coined the name way back then.
It's so fascinating that the branding existed over a century before the first shovel hit the dirt. They even wrote it into their 1891 Constitution as a legal mandate.
Yeah, and in 1922, they actually went out to the Central Plateau and dropped a foundation stone in the middle of nowhere.
And then essentially just went back to the beach.
Pretty much. Rio just kept growing, and the interior remained isolated.
So moving the capital was just this perpetual political myth that nobody actually wanted to execute.
Right. Well, until the 1950s, that's when the myth met a uniquely potent political ideology.
Developmentalism.
Exactly. In the post-war period, developmentalism was this macroeconomic strategy where the state took massive, aggressive action to rapidly industrialize.
Largely through import substitution, right?
Right.
Trying to leapfrog the slow, organic stages of economic growth.
Yes, and the ultimate champion of this ideology was President Juscelino Kubitschek, or JK.
Okay, so JK comes into power in 1956. He's this former doctor, highly charismatic, and his whole political brand is built on a famous slogan.
50 years and 5.
Right. Promising a half-century of economic and social progress compressed into a single 5-year presidential term.
And for Kubitschek, Brasilia was the ultimate engine for that acceleration. It wasn't just a monument. It was a geopolitical forcing mechanism.
By relocating the seat of federal power to the Central Plateau, this scrubby savanna, known as the Cerrado, he was forcing the entire nation to pivot inward.
Exactly. Because to physically build and supply this new capital, they had to carve thousands of miles of new highways through the jungle and the savanna.
Which is a brutal but brilliant way to integrate the national territory almost overnight.
It really was.
I see the geopolitical logic, but let's look at the risk management here. Using the relocation of your entire federal government as a catalyst for infrastructure development is incredibly reckless.
Oh, absolutely.
Because if the project stalls, you've just stranded your government in a desert. So JK establishes Novacap, the state company managing the build, and slaps a non-negotiable deadline on it.
Right. The city must be completely inaugurated before he leaves office in 1960.
Which is an impossible timeline. It forced them to skip over all the normal iterations of urban planning.
Which is precisely why they had to rely on a contest. They just didn't have time to slowly debate zoning laws.
So in 1957, they launched a national competition for the city's pilot plan.
And the winner was Lúcio Costa, a deeply intellectual Brazilian urbanist. And his design was the absolute epitome of high modernism.
And we need to be clear about what modernism meant in this specific context. We aren't just talking about buildings that look sleek and futuristic.
No, not at all. This was a rigid philosophy, heavily influenced by Le Corbusier and international modernist congresses.
The core tenet was absolute rationalism.
Right.
Form follows function, stripping away all historical ornamentation.
And separating the chaotic elements of a city into distinct, highly controlled zones, Costa's master plan took that to its logical extreme.
By organizing the city along two intersecting axes.
Exactly. The first is the monumental axis. If you picture that airplane layout, this is the fuselage.
The machine of government.
Yes, it contains the esplanade of ministries, the Congress, the Supreme Court. It's scaled for the state, not the individual.
Right. Vast lawns, massive avenues, designed to project an intimidating sense of immense institutional power.
And to design the actual levers of that machine, J.K. brings in his longtime collaborator, the architect Oscar Niemeyer.
And Niemeyer's work here is iconic. He contrasts Costa's rigid, linear urban planning with these sweeping, gravity-defying, lyrical concrete structures.
The National Congress with its contrasting dome and bowl, the crown-like cathedral with its massive stained glass.
It is visually stunning, deliberately engineered to signal to the world that Brazil had arrived at the bleeding edge of the future.
It's a visual masterpiece. But, the true sociological experiment was happening on the other axis.
The residential axis, the curved wings of the airplane.
Exactly. This is where Costa designed what he called the superquadras, or superblocks.
Highly standardized, self-contained residential sectors.
Right. Every block had a strict height limit of 6 stories, and they were lifted off the ground on pillars, or pilares, so the ground level remained an open public park.
And the social engineering intent behind these superquadras is just wild. Costa envisioned these blocks as the great equalizers.
The idea was that the Minister of State and the building's janitor would live in the exact same superquadra.
Shop at the same local commercial strip, send their kids to the exact same neighborhood school.
It was an explicitly Marxist, egalitarian vision of society mapped out in concrete. What's fascinating here is the massive ideological contradiction at the heart of the project.
Because you have President Kubitschek driving this rapid capitalist developmentalist expansion.
Yeah, and he hands the blueprints over to Costa and Niemeyer, 2 men deeply embedded in socialist and communist ideologies.
They were literally trying to use the architecture of the state to force a classless society. But looking at how a superquadra actually functions, the mechanism feels deeply flawed. Well, designing a city this way is like trying to build a perfectly sterile terrarium.
Right.
You can mathematically control the soil depth, the exact temperature, space out every single plant.
Right.
But the moment you introduce the unpredictable, chaotic elements of real life, the rigid ecosystem collapses because it has zero capacity to adapt.
That's a great analogy.
Because by zoning, living here, working there, and recreation way over there, you completely eliminate the organic friction that makes a city vibrant.
No corner bodega, no spontaneous street life.
Exactly.
You've isolated the core critique that urban sociologists have leveled against Brasilia for decades.
Oh, really?
Yeah. In their pursuit of a flawless, rational utopia, the modernists completely sanitized the urban experience.
Because they removed the messy overlap of commerce and residence.
Exactly. They eliminated the serendipity of public life. The city became profoundly isolating because it was designed for a theoretical, idealized citizen.
Not an actual human being. And speaking of actual human beings, we have to talk about how this terrarium was actually built.
Right, the construction.
Because to go from Costa's rational sketches to a functional city in under 4 years required a staggering, almost incomprehensible logistical mobilization.
It was an epic saga of labor and logistics. Remember, there were no highways connecting the coast to the interior yet.
So how did they get the materials there?
The early construction materials, the cement, the steel, heavy machinery, it all had to be airlifted into the Cerrado or driven on precarious dirt trails that washed out in the rain.
Wow. And for the physical labor, the government relied on a massive influx of migrant workers known as the candangos.
Yes, the candangos.
The sources are brutal when detailing their reality. The vast majority were migrating from Brazil's northeast, driven by a desperate need to escape systemic poverty and devastating droughts.
They poured into the Central Plateau because Kubitschek's propaganda machine promised them high wages and a stake in the future.
But the reality on the ground was a nightmare.
It was an environment of extreme exploitation. They lived in precarious, makeshift camps, entirely devoid of basic sanitation.
And working extenuating, around-the-clock shifts under massive floodlights, just to meet JK's impossible deadline.
Plus, the climate of the Cerrado is incredibly dry and harsh.
I read it was so naturally inhospitable to dense human settlement that they actually had to dam a river.
Yeah, they engineered an enormous artificial body of water, Lake Paranoa,
just to increase the ambient humidity enough to make the microclimate tolerable. That is insane.
It is, and the government just pushed them relentlessly. By 1958, the site is still an apocalyptic expanse of red dirt and rebar.
But they forced it over the finish line. On April 21st, 1960, the city is officially inaugurated.
And the brilliance, the cynical marketing behind that specific date is notable.
Yeah, April 21st is the national holiday honoring Tiradentes, the great martyr of the 18th century Brazilian independence movement.
JK deliberately synchronized the opening of this hypermodern city with the oldest, most sacred mythos of the nation.
Instantly manufacturing a sense of historical legitimacy for a city that was exactly 0 days old.
It was a masterclass in political theater. The global press corps stood on the monumental axis, staring at Niemeyer's gleaming white palaces, completely awestruck.
But there was a dark, tragic irony unfolding, right?
Yes. The city was finished, but the candangos, the people whose labor actually built the utopia, were immediately informed that the utopia was not for them.
Right, and here's where it gets really interesting. When the ribbon is cut, the pristine logic of the pilot plan instantly shatters against the reality of class economics.
Because Costa's master plan had a hard population cap.
It simply did not account for the tens of thousands of workers who decided to stay in the region after construction ended.
They couldn't afford the apartments in the superquadras.
So the state essentially bulldozed their construction camps and pushed them out past the Greenbelt, far away from the monumental center.
And this leads directly to the defining structural failure of Brasilia, socio-spatial segregation.
The workers were relocated to what became known as the satellite cities.
Right. Unplanned, deeply precarious, informal settlements that lacked the sanitation, transportation, and infrastructure of the pilot plan.
The planners tried to build a classless society, but their inflexible design practically mandated the creation of slums.
And the mechanism that enforced that segregation was the automobile.
Right, when you look at Brasilia's layout, it is incredibly hostile to the pedestrian.
No traditional straight corners, no crosswalks. It's a city of massive highways and complex cloverleaf interchanges.
But we have to understand the mindset of the 1950s modernist, right?
Absolutely. To them, designing a city exclusively for the car was not viewed as an elitist choice. Quite the opposite.
The automobile was viewed as the ultimate tool of democratization, an egalitarian machine giving every citizen total freedom of movement.
They assumed that in the future, universal prosperity meant every single family would own a car.
But that assumption was completely divorced from economic reality. By designing a city that required a car to navigate, they accidentally created a massive barrier to entry.
Yes, exactly. If you were a worker banished to a satellite city and you didn't own a car, your daily commute into the center to clean the ministries or serve the coffee became an agonizing, hours-long ordeal on underfunded public transit.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it is a staggering failure of foresight.
Because the perfect, manicured center, populated by wealthy politicians and bureaucrats, physically and economically parasitizes the invisible, chaotic periphery that keeps it running.
It physically baked the deep historical inequalities of Brazil right into the geography of the new capital.
It proved definitively that you cannot mandate social equality through concrete. When you attempt to engineer a perfectly sterile, rational environment, you invariably push the friction and poverty to the margins.
Out of sight of the planners.
Yeah.
The terrarium couldn't hold the ecosystem.
That's exactly right.
But what I find truly inspiring in the source material is that the story doesn't end with a sterile dystopia. You can dictate the exact width of an avenue and the height of an apartment block, but you cannot dictate how human beings will behave.
Right. The people of Brasilia adapted. They did what people always do. They found a way to live.
Over the decades, the residents began to rebel against the clinical rigidity of the blueprint.
They carved informal footpaths, desire paths, through the pristine modernist lawns.
They set up informal street markets in the empty monumental voids, through massive festivals around the lake.
They essentially took Costa and Niemeyer's cold, theoretical masterpiece and injected it with the vibrant, chaotic, messy reality of Brazilian culture.
As the sources say, they added the salt and taste that the architects completely left out. They humanized the machine.
And despite the profound socioeconomic flaws, the sheer audacity of what was accomplished in the Cerrado is universally recognized today.
The global architectural community definitely recognized the magnitude of the achievement.
Yeah, in 1987, UNESCO designated Brasilia as a World Heritage Site.
Which is an incredibly rare distinction to confer upon a 20th century city.
It cemented Brasilia's legacy not just as a national capital, but as one of the most important architectural monuments in human history.
So what does this all mean? We look at this city today, and it embodies this impossible contradiction.
On one hand, it's a breathtaking secular cathedral dedicated to the 20th century belief in boundless state power.
A testament to the idea that human willpower can conquer nature and compress 50 years of history into 5.
Yet simultaneously, it serves as a permanent cautionary monument.
Proving that a city is not merely a geometric puzzle to be solved on a drafting table.
Right. A city is a living, breathing organism that requires flexibility, organic growth, and a tolerance for chaos.
When you prioritize the perfection of the blueprint over the reality of the people living inside it, you don't eliminate inequality.
You just institutionalize it.
Which brings us to the ultimate takeaway for you, our listener. We started with a 17th century geopolitical fear.
Watched it morph into a mid-century sprint to conquer the interior.
And saw the collision of high modernist philosophy with the sweat of the candangos.
We saw how the dream of the superquadra and the automobile unintentionally engineered a deeply divided society.
And as we close this deep dive, there is a highly relevant thought we want to leave you with.
Because we are currently living through a massive resurgence of the exact same utopian hubris that built Brasilia.
Oh, totally. Right now, tech millionaires and ambitious autocrats are proposing brand new smart cities.
Places like Neom in Saudi Arabia or Tolosa in the American desert, they are promising perfectly rational, algorithm-driven, sustainable utopias built from scratch on a blank slate.
And as we look at these sleek, new, futuristic renderings, we have to ask ourselves, are we just repainting the superquadras?
Right. If you design a flawless, friction-free city for the elite of tomorrow, who exactly is going to be banished to the unseen satellite cities just to keep the terrarium functioning?
It really makes you wonder what happens when the algorithmic blueprints of today inevitably crash into the messy dust of reality. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the systems designed around you and stay insanely curious until next time.